The sun had just begun to cast long shadows across the neat lawns of the suburbs when she would start her run. Ilara moved with a liquid grace that seemed at odds with the world around her. A world defined by rigid property lines and predictable schedules. At 30, she was the owner of a small but successful business designing and planting private gardens. Her clients loved her for her quiet efficiency in the almost magical way. She could transform a patch of grass into a tranquil sanctuary. She spoke little about herself, her conversations always circling back to soil composition, sunlight exposure, and the resilience of perennials. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who kept to herself, the one who would offer a polite, distant nod, but rarely engaged in small talk. They saw a woman who was gentle, perhaps a little lonely, living a life as orderly and meticulously planned as one of her own garden designs. They saw the calm surface, but they could never guess the depth of the water beneath. That calm was something Ilara had practiced for years. It was a discipline, a tool forged in places her neighbors could never imagine. While she now spent her days with her hands in the dirt, there was a time when they had been covered in chalk and grime. A time when her life was measured in heartbeats between chaos and control. She had left that world behind, trading the adrenaline of impossible odds for the quiet satisfaction of seeing a sapling take root. She had earned the silence, and she guarded it fiercely. Her morning run was a meditation, a way to let her body go through the motions while her mind remained a still, placid lake. She ran before the world woke up, before the noise and the demands could begin to ripple the surface. To anyone who might have been watching, she was just another woman getting her exercise. But the way she scanned her surroundings, the measured pace of her breathing spoke of a different kind of training. A life lived on the razor's edge. Officer Finn Miller saw the world in sharp, uncompromising lines. There was order, and there was disorder. He was the instrument of order. For 15 years, he had worn the badge of the local police department. For 15 years, he had worked to bend the world to his understanding of it. His colleagues saw him as a solid, dependable cop, the kind of man you wanted backing you up in a tough spot. His superiors saw his arrest numbers, his clean record, and the Officer of the Month plaque on his wall. But if you looked closely, past the crisp uniform and the square jaw, you could see the rigidity in his eyes. Authority was not just a part of his job. It was the core of his identity. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that the badge he wore made him fundamentally different and fundamentally superior. To the people he was sworn to protect and serve, he was on patrol that Tuesday afternoon, riding shotgun with a rookie half his age. The kid was eager, a little too talkative, and Miller was mostly ignoring him, letting the chatter wash over him like static. He was the anchor in this floating world, the solid weight that kept everything from drifting into chaos. He coached the rookie not on fairness, but on control. "Never let them see you hesitate," he'd say, his voice a low gravel. "The second they think you don't know what you're doing, you've lost them. You have to establish authority from the get-go." To Miller, the streets were a constant battle for dominance, and he intended to win every single time. It wasn't about being liked. It was about being obeyed. That's when he saw the car. A modest, slightly dusty sedan that slowed for the intersection at the end of Maple Street. It didn't come to a complete stop. The tires barely hesitated before the car rolled through the stop sign and continued on its way. It was the kind of minor violation that 1,000 cars commit every day. Most officers would let it go. Finn Miller was not most officers. A spark of irritation lit up in his chest. It wasn't about the traffic law. It was about the principle. Someone somewhere had decided the rules didn't apply to them. "Light up," he said to the rookie, his voice flat and cold. The siren gave a short whoop, and the sedan pulled over to the curb 100 yards later. A textbook compliance. As Miller walked up to the driver's side window, he was already running the plates through the computer in his head. The window slid down before he got there. Inside, the woman had her hands placed at the 10-2 position on the steering wheel. Her license and registration already held between her fingers. It was perfect. Too perfect. It felt rehearsed. "Afternoon, officer," she said. Her voice was steady, Even, not scared, not annoyed, just neutral. "Do you know why I pulled you over today, ma'am?" Miller asked, his tone dripping with the practiced condescension he reserved for traffic stops. "I assume for the stop sign back there, officer?" "I apologize. I was distracted." Her eyes met his through the open window. They were a clear, calm blue, and they held no fear. They held nothing. It was like looking into a still pond, and it unnerved him. People were supposed to be nervous when he pulled them over. They were supposed to stammer, to make excuses, to show deference. This woman was acting like they were two strangers waiting for a bus, distracted, Miller said, leaning in a little, letting his shadow fall over her. "What could be so important that you forget a basic traffic law?" Her expression didn't change. "It's not an excuse, officer. It was a lapse in judgment. It won't happen again." The calmness was infuriating him. It felt like an act. He felt like she was mocking him, challenging him with her tranquility. He took her license and registration and walked back to his cruiser, the rookie watching him. Miller could feel his anger simmering. This woman, with her neat clothes and her controlled demeanor, thought she was better than him. He could see it in her eyes. She thought his authority was a joke. He ran her information. Clean record. Not so much as a parking ticket. That only made it worse. She was one of those people who floated through life, untouchable, believing the rules were for other people. He decided then and there that she needed a lesson. A small, inconvenient, expensive lesson that would remind her that no one is above the law. He filled out the ticket for the rolling stop, his pen pressing hard into the paper. But it wasn't enough. He wanted to see a crack in that calm facade. He walked back to the car and handed her the ticket. She took it without a word. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but notice something else while I was here," Miller said, his voice taking on a officious, helpful tone that was pure poison. He gestured with his chin toward the rearview mirror where a small, pine tree-shaped air freshener dangled from a string. "That air freshener. It's obstructing your view. State law says anything hanging from your rear view is a violation. I'm going to have to cite you for that as well." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed her face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was a deep, profound wariness. She looked from the ticket in her hand to the officer's cold, satisfied eyes. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that this had nothing to do with an air freshener. This was a power play. "Officer," she said, her voice a little quieter now. "That's been in my car for 2 years. And you've been breaking the law for 2 years," he countered, a small, cruel smile touching the corner of his mouth. He had one. He had provoked a response. He had forced his reality onto hers. She didn't argue. There was no point. She just nodded slowly, a gesture of acceptance that he mistook for defeat. He handed her the second ticket, the paper feeling like a piece of lead in her hand. "Have a good day, ma'am," he said. The words a final twist of the knife. He walked back to his cruiser and watched her drive away. He felt the satisfaction settle in his chest, warm and familiar. He had restored order. He had put a disrespectful citizen in her place. But as her car disappeared down the road, the feeling began to curdle. She hadn't been defeated. She had been patient. The look on her face at the end wasn't defeat. It was the look of someone marking a moment, committing it to memory. Finn Miller gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The satisfaction was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resentment. He had a feeling that this wasn't over. He had a feeling that he had just made a powerful enemy, and he didn't know why. All he knew was that her stillness, her unbreachable calm, had felt like a challenge to everything he was. And he was going to have to break her. He was going to have to destroy it. Asterisk, the first few days after the traffic stop were like a bad dream Alara couldn't wake from. She went about her work, meeting with clients about new rose beds and stone pathways. But a knot of unease had taken root in her stomach. It wasn't about the tickets or the $200 it would cost her. It was about the look in the officer's eyes. It was the cold, deliberate pleasure he took in his small act of power. In her old life, she had learned to trust her instincts, to recognize the subtle shifts in a person's energy that signaled a threat. Her instincts were screaming now. This wasn't a random encounter. This was the beginning of something. Her instinct proved correct. 3 days later, she was leaving a client's house when the familiar flash of red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. It was the same officer, Finn Miller. This time, the supposed infraction was a faulty brake light. He stood by the rear of her car, tapping the plastic housing with his pen. "Looks like one of these isn't working, ma'am," he said, his voice a low drawl. He was enjoying this. Elara got out and stood beside him. "They were all working yesterday, officer." "Well, they aren't now," he said, not looking at her. "Things break." He wrote her another ticket, this one for an equipment violation. As he handed it to her, he let his gaze linger on her for a moment too long. The look wasn't just condescending anymore. It was predatory. He was letting her know he was there. He was watching that same week. It happened again. This time he claimed she failed to signal for a full 100 yards before making a turn. The stop was on a quiet side street, and it was just him, her, and the hum of the idling engines. He didn't even pretend it was about the traffic violation this time. He leaned against her driver's side door, his arms crossed over his chest. "You have a real nice routine," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Up early for a run. Work all day. Home by 6. It's a good life." Simple. Elara didn't respond. She kept her hands on the steering wheel, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. She knew what he was doing. He was drawing a circle around her, marking her territory, showing her that he knew her patterns, her life. He was trying to get inside her head, to make her feel watched, exposed. "You live in that little house on the corner of Elm and Cedar, right?" he continued. "Nice little garden in the front. You do that yourself?" The question, so simple on the surface, landed like a punch. He wasn't just pulling her over. He was going to her home. He was watching her house. A cold fear, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. For the first time in a long time, she felt a tremor of true vulnerability. This wasn't a battlefield you could see or map. This was her life, her sanctuary, and he was dragging it into the open. She gave a single, tight nod. "Just making conversation," he said with a shrug, but the triumph in his eyes was unmistakable. He had finally made her show something. He had made her feel afraid. He straightened up and tapped on the roof of her car. "Drive safe now." The harassment became a constant presence in her life. A week didn't go by without another stop. Sometimes it was a legitimate-sounding reason. Sometimes it was flimsy enough to be laughable, but the result was always the same. A new ticket, a verbal jab, a reminder that he was there. He started parking his cruiser on her street for hours at a time, sometimes late at night. He'd just sit there, the engine running, a silent, imposing figure in the dark. The neighbors began to notice. She could feel their eyes on her, see the questions in their faces. The quiet woman who kept to herself was suddenly drawing police attention. The whispers started, quiet and poisonous. Drugs, trouble with the law. Elara's work began to suffer. She was a landscape architect, a job that required focus and creativity. But her mind was constantly on high alert, scanning for his patrol car. She would jump at the sound of a distant siren. Her hands, usually so steady when planting delicate seedlings, would tremble slightly. A longtime client, a kind elderly woman who had become a friend, pulled her aside after a meeting. "Honey, are you all right?" The woman asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "You seem on edge, and I've seen that police car near your house a few times. Is everything okay?" How could she explain it? How could she possibly articulate the slow, deliberate campaign of psychological terror she was enduring? It sounded paranoid, crazy. "I'm fine, Martha," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just a few disagreements with the local traffic laws." But Martha didn't look convinced. A seed of doubt had been planted. When Elara submitted a new design for a community project a few days later, Martha, who was on the planning committee, didn't champion it as she usually would. The committee passed on the design, citing concerns about the applicant's stability. The rejection stung. It was the first real consequence outside of her direct interactions with the officer. He was polluting her whole world. Finally, she knew she couldn't just take it anymore. She had to do something the proper way. She made an appointment with the department's Internal Affairs Division. She sat in a sterile, windowless room and laid out her story to a man in a suit who looked bored. She listed the dates, the times, the false accusations. She told him about the surveillance, the questions about her home, the chilling visits to her street. The man, Detective Harding, listened without interrupting, his pen making occasional notes on a legal pad. When she was finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Ms. Vance," he said, looking at her file, "we've looked at Officer Miller. He has a stellar record. Sherwood years without a single citizen complaint that resulted in any action. All of these tickets you've mentioned? Well, they're all for minor infractions. Rolling stops, broken lights. It's his word against yours." "But they're not real," she insisted, her voice tight. "He's targeting me. He's harassing me." "Harassment is a difficult thing to prove," Harding said, his voice clinical and detached. "He says he's just proactively policing his beat. He saw your vehicle. He saw infractions. He acted. That's his job. Without hard evidence or recording, a witness who can corroborate your story, there's not much we can do. It looks on paper like a personality clash. A personality clash." Ilara repeated, the words tasting like poison. "He's destroying my life." "We will note your complaint," Harding said, standing up. The meeting was over. "We'll have a talk with him. Remind him to be professional." But I wouldn't expect any further action. It was exactly what she had feared. The system was designed to protect its own. Her complaint wasn't a spark of justice. It was a flicker that he would feel, a warning that he had been noticed. She had just made things worse, and she was right. The week after her meeting with Internal Affairs, the pressure intensified. It was as if Officer Miller had been given a green light. He became more brazen. He started using his authority in other ways. She discovered that a bolo a on the lookout alert had been entered for her car. The alert, which other officers could see on their in-car computers, described her vehicle as suspected involvement in a recent string of garage burglaries. It was a complete fabrication. But it was now official police business. One evening, a young officer she had never seen before pulled her over. He was tense, his hand resting near his sidearm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shaky. He was following a directive from the bolo, expecting a potential criminal. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the genuine fear in the young officer's eyes, and she understood the true evil of what Miller was doing. He wasn't just harassing her anymore. He was using her to terrorize other officers, and using other officers to terrorize her. He was twisting the entire system into a weapon against her. She explained the situation as calmly as she could, but the young officer was hesitant. He had to follow protocol. It took 20 minutes, a call to his sergeant, and a growing crowd of curious neighbors before she was finally let go with a gruff apology. By the time she got back to her house, the damage was done. The sight of her being pulled over, frisked on the side of the road, was all the evidence her neighbors needed. The whispers were no longer quiet. They were loud and judgmental. She was a problem. She was trouble. She was the woman who brought the police to their quiet street. Friends she had known for years suddenly had other plans. Calls went unanswered. Her world, the quiet, ordered life she had so carefully built, was becoming a fortress under siege, and she was completely alone. The man with the badge didn't have to fire a single shot to destroy her. He was doing it with suspicion, with paper, and with the quiet. Corrosive power of a lie. Asterisk, the quiet siege had worn Ilara down to her very bones. Every morning she would wake up with a feeling of dread, a weight in her chest that made it hard to breathe. The world outside her door had become a hostile territory. Her phone, once a tool for her business, now sat silent on her counter. Her email inbox, once full of design proposals and client inquiries, was mostly empty. The Whisper campaign had worked. No one wanted to be associated with the woman who was always in trouble with the law. Her savings were rapidly shrinking, eaten away by legal fees and the loss of income. She was a ghost in her own life, haunted by the persistent, looming figure of Officer Miller. She knew he was watching, waiting. She could feel his presence like a change in the weather, a constant, oppressive humidity that promised a storm she couldn't escape. Officer Miller was not a patient man, but he was a methodical one. He knew that the campaign of harassment had done its work. He had isolated her, broken her connections to the community, and ruined her reputation. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't a clean victory. She hadn't broken. Not completely. There was still a core of defiance in her that infuriated him. The internal affairs complaint, even though it went nowhere, had been a sign of rebellion. He needed to end it. He needed to shatter her completely, to leave her with nothing, not even her own name. He began to lay his final, most devastating trap. He spent weeks thinking it through, planning every detail. It had to be perfect. It had to be something that would leave no room for doubt, no space for her to maneuver. He needed to create a reality in which she was the villain and he was the hero. He started by studying her schedule. He knew she did a lot of her own shopping for supplies. Visiting a large home and garden warehouse on the edge of town every other Friday, it was a chaotic place, with sprawling aisles and a constant stream of customers. Perfect for what he had in mind. He spent a few Fridays casing the place, watching her movements. He noted which aisle she visited most often, the one with organic fertilizers and pest control. He watched how she paid, always with a card, and how she loaded her own purchases into the back of her car. She was always alone, focused, efficient. She never lingered. The day he chose was overcast, the sky a flat, oppressive gray. Ilara felt the heaviness in the air as she drove to the warehouse store. She was running low on everything, and she forced herself to go, telling herself she couldn't let him win, couldn't let him trap her in her own home. She pushed a rattling cart through the wide aisles, grabbing bags of soil, flats of seasonal flowers, the specific organic fertilizer she preferred. She was trying to focus on the simple, grounding task of her work, but her senses were on high alert. Every reflection in the polished concrete floor, every person who lingered a little too long behind her, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She paid quickly and wheeled her cart out to the parking lot, her head on a swivel, as she loaded the heavy bags into the back of her car. A large panel van with the words Miller's Pest Control on the side pulled into the spot next to her. The driver, a man in a dusty uniform, got out and nodded at her. "Heavy stuff," he said with a friendly grin. "It is," she replied, her guard still up. "Here, let me give you a hand with that last one," he said, gesturing to a large bag of mulch. Before she could refuse, he had easily lifted it and slid it into her trunk. As he did, he stumbled slightly, dropping a small, tightly sealed plastic bag on the floor of her car near the driver's seat. "Oh, whoops," he said, quickly leaning in to pick it up. "My bad, must have fallen out of my pocket." He flashed her the bag. It looked like a sample of some kind of granular pesticide. "A little bit of this stuff, and you won't have to worry about aphids." Ilara just nodded, eager for the interaction to be over. "Thanks for your help," she said, closing the trunk. "No problem," he said, getting back into his van and driving away. Ilara didn't give it a second thought. She got into her car, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot. She was halfway home when she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank. It was him. Of course it was him. She felt a familiar wave of nausea, a mix of fear and sheer exhausted frustration. She pulled over, killing the engine. This time, she didn't even reach for her license. She just rested her hands on the steering wheel and waited for the inevitable approach of Officer Miller. He walked up to her window, his usual swagger in full effect. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with a feigned politeness that was more insulting than any open hostility. "You know why I stopped you today?" "No, officer," she said, her voice flat and tired. "You were swerving a bit back there. Just wanted to make sure you were okay." He leaned down, peering into her car. "You look a little pale. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine. You sure?" He pressed, his eyes scanning the interior of her car. "Because my training tells me that people who are this pale and this calm are often under the influence of something. Have you taken any illegal substances today?" The accusation was so blunt, so absurd, that for a second Ilara didn't know how to respond. "No, officer, I have not." "Well, I have a strong suspicion," Miller said, his voice dropping to a serious, authoritative tone. "And based on that suspicion, I have probable cause to search your vehicle. Please step out of the car, ma'am. It was the moment she had been dreading. The final escalation. He was going to tear her car apart, looking for something that wasn't there. It would be humiliating, it would draw a crowd, but it would also be proof that this was all a sham. She had done nothing wrong. She complied, getting out of the car and standing on the grassy shoulder. Her arms crossed against the chill in the air. Miller called for backup on his radio. And within minutes, another cruiser arrived. He began his search, starting with a methodical pat-down of the seats. He moved to the trunk, pulling out the bags of soil and flowers, tossing them carelessly onto the side of the road. He was putting on a show for the other officer and for the small audience of curious drivers who were slowing down to watch. He was enjoying every second of it. Then he moved back to the driver's side, his eyes narrowing. He was looking for something specific. He knelt down, peering under the seat. Then, with a dramatic grunt of effort, he reached his hand deep into the dark space beside the seat and pulled out a small, tightly sealed plastic bag. It looked exactly like the one the pest control man had dropped. He held it up, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "What do we have here?" He opened the bag and pinched a small amount of the white crystalline powder between his fingers. He brought it to his nose for a moment. "Looks like we found your problem, ma'am," he said, turning to face her, the bag held high like a trophy. "This is methamphetamine. You're under arrest." The world tilted on its axis. The accusation was so impossible, so insane, that Alara felt a wave of vertigo. "That's not mine," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I've never seen that before." "Tell it to the judge," Miller said, as the other officer came over to handcuff her. The metal was cold against her wrists. The click of the ratchets was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of her life ending. The arrest was brutal and public. They paraded her to the patrol car, her hands cuffed behind her back, her head forced down. News of the bust spread like wildfire. By the evening news, she was a headline. Local landscape architect arrested for major drug possession. They showed a picture of her from some old community event. Next to a picture of Officer Miller, looking proud and heroic. The story he fed the press was a masterpiece. He was a proactive, eagle-eyed cop who had noticed erratic driving and, following his instincts, had taken a dangerous drug dealer off the streets. He had saved the community. The fallout was immediate and absolute. Her biggest client, the elderly woman who had once been her friend, called her, her voice shaking with disappointment and betrayal. The planning committee not only fired her from all current projects, but barred her from any future municipal work. Her landlord served her with an eviction notice, citing a morals clause in her lease. Her bank froze her accounts. The system, which had been so reluctant to act on her complaints, moved with lightning speed to punish her for this crime. She was no longer Alara Vance, quiet garden designer. She was Alara Vance, drug felon. A monster, sitting in the cold, gray holding cell. Waiting for her court-appointed lawyer, she felt a despair so profound it was almost peaceful. It was over. He had one. He had created a new reality for her, and in this reality, she was guilty. Her lawyer, a young, overworked man named Paul, was sympathetic but realistic. "The evidence is strong, Alara," he said, his voice low and weary. "They found the drugs in your car. Miller is a decorated cop with a clean record. The jury is going to believe him. The prosecutor is offering a plea deal. Plead guilty, and they'll recommend a 5-year sentence. If you go to trial and you're found guilty, you could get 10. I have to advise you to take it." Alara looked at him, her face a mask of stone. "I'm not guilty." "I know you say that," Paul said, rubbing his tired eyes. "But it doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what you can prove. And right now, you have no way of proving that bag wasn't yours. It's your word against his." He was right. She had nothing. No witnesses, no proof, no one to stand up for her. She was completely and utterly alone. The story was written. She was the villain. And the hero was getting away with the perfect crime. She looked at her reflection in the small, reinforced window of the cell. The face that stared back was pale, hollowed out, and defeated. For the first time, a single hot tear traced a path down her cheek. She felt her own strength, the discipline she had fought so hard to maintain, begin to crumble into dust. He hadn't just ruined her life, he had broken her spirit. And as she sat there in the encroaching darkness, she began to wonder if it wouldn't just be easier to let him win. To take the deal, to disappear into the system, and to finally let the silence, the one she had once cherished, swallow her whole. The courtroom was a box of old wood and hushed silence, a place that felt built for crushing hopes. Alara sat at the defendant's table, the weight of every word spoken pressing down on her shoulders. The past few weeks had been a slow, methodical dismantling of her life. The prosecutor, a man with a sharp suit and an even sharper voice, had painted her as a monster, hiding in plain sight. He showed pictures of her quiet house, her orderly garden, and twisted them into evidence of a secretive, antisocial nature. Her solitude was now her pathology. Her silence was her guilt. Every person who took the stand, whether they knew her or not, seemed to chip away another piece of her character until there was almost nothing left. The man who had put her there, Officer Finn Miller, sat on the witness stand like a king on his throne. He wore his uniform as if it were a second skin, a perfect fit for his posture and his pride. He recounted the day of her arrest with a smooth, rehearsed confidence that made the story feel unshakable. He spoke of his instincts, his duty, and the suspiciously calm behavior he had observed. He was a protector, a guardian of the peace, and she was the threat he had bravely identified. The jury watched him with a look of reverence. He was one of them, a man who wore a badge to keep their streets safe. She was an outsider, an anomaly. It was clear who they believed. When it was her turn to testify, every eye in the room felt like a physical touch. She walked to the stand, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, and placed her hand on the Bible. The prosecutor's questions were like little jabs, each one designed to make her flinch. "Isn't it true, Ms. Vance, that you had a history of conflict with Officer Miller?" he asked, his voice laced with accusation. "I had a history of him pulling me over," she corrected, her voice quiet. "A history of you receiving traffic citations from him. A history of you filing a formal complaint against him that went nowhere. Were you angry, Ms. Vance? Angry that this officer was just doing his job? Was this your revenge?" "No," she said, her voice steady. "I was trying to make him stop." The answer was true, but in the cold context of the courtroom it sounded thin and desperate. It was her word against the word of a decorated police officer. The evidence they had presented, the bag of drugs found in her car, the Bolo alert, the string of traffic stops, created a web of guilt that was almost impossible to talk her way out of. She could feel the jury's sympathy draining away with every passing minute. She was a liar, a manipulator, a criminal trying to weasel out of the consequences of her actions. By the time her cross-examination was over, she felt hollowed out. She had told the truth, but the truth had lost. Her public defender, a young man named Paul, who looked as tired as she felt, stood up to begin his cross-examination of Officer Miller. It felt like a formality, a final, hopeless march before the inevitable verdict. Paul's steps were slow as he approached the witness stand. There was no fire in his eyes, no hint of a gotcha moment. He just looked like a man with a very difficult job to do. "Officer Miller," Paul began, his voice calm, "you described Ms. Vance's behavior as suspiciously calm. You also noted that her breathing was controlled and rhythmic. Is that a fair summary of your testimony?" "Yes, it is," Miller answered, a hint of smugness in his tone. "It was not normal behavior." "And after she was arrested and placed in the back of your cruiser, paramedics were called to the scene. Is that correct?" "Yes, standard procedure." "And they recorded her vital signs, correct?" "They did." "And what did they find?" Paul asked, his voice dropping slightly. The prosecutor looked up from his table, a flicker of confusion on his face. This line of questioning seemed to be going nowhere. Miller hesitated, annoyed. They noted her heart rate was lower than would be expected for a person in a high-stress situation. "Lower than expected," Paul repeated, looking at the jury. "Officer Miller, in all your 15 years on the force, Have you ever seen a person under extreme duress who displayed a low heart rate and controlled breathing? People can go into shock, Miller said dismissively. Was Ms. Vance in shock? Paul pressed. No, she was in control. Controlled, Paul said softly. He walked back to his table and picked up a thick, sealed envelope. Your Honor, the defense wishes to enter into evidence a file that was previously sealed under a federal court order. We ask the court's permission to unseal it now. The prosecutor shot to his feet, his face a mask of outrage. Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. The prosecution has had no opportunity to review this evidence. The defense is engaging in theatrics. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Judge Harlow, fixed her gaze on Paul. What is the nature of this evidence, counsel? Your Honor, Paul said, his voice now ringing with a quiet intensity that filled the room. It is the only evidence that can explain the witness's testimony. It is the only context in which the defendant's behavior makes any sense. It is the only thing that shows that this entire case is built on a lie of epic proportions. Judge Harlow studied Elara's tired face, then looked at Miller's arrogant expression. She let out a long, slow breath. I will allow it. The seal is lifted. Let's see it. With a steady hand, Paul slid the document from the envelope and passed it to the clerk. The clerk, a bored man who had seen it all, glanced at the first page. His eyes went wide. He looked up at Paul, then at the judge, his mouth slightly agape. Judge Harlow took the paper from him. As she read, her own stern composure cracked, just for a second. Her eyebrows shot up in pure, unadulterated astonishment. Your Honor, Paul said, his voice now the only sound in the suddenly silent room. The woman sitting at the defendant's table is not who the prosecutor has portrayed her to be. The woman sitting there is Lieutenant Commander Elara Vance, retired. Of the United States Navy, she served for 10 years as an operator in Naval Special Warfare Command. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The jury members stared, their mouths open. The prosecutor looked as though he'd seen a ghost. And on the witness stand, Officer Finn Miller, the hero cop, went as white as a sheet. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a sweaty, panicked mask of a man who had just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. Paul continued, his voice growing stronger. For 6 of those years, Commander Vance was part of the most elite counterterrorism unit in the world. The controlled breathing and low heart rate you described, Officer Miller? It's a stress management technique called tactical breathing, taught to every single operator. It's designed to lower the heart rate and focus the mind under extreme fire. Her calmness wasn't the sign of a cold-blooded criminal. It was the involuntary muscle memory of a highly trained soldier who has spent years practicing how to control her biological response to mortal danger. He held up another file. We have also received sworn affidavits from her former commanding officers, all sealed until this moment. They describe a woman of unshakable character and discipline. They speak of a leader who has risked her life, not once but repeatedly, to defend the very principles of law and freedom that this officer has so callously trampled. Paul turned his gaze away from the jury and fixed it directly on Finn Miller. The look on his face was not one of anger, but of profound pity. You picked a fight with a woman you thought was weak and alone, Officer Miller. You saw her silence as a sign of guilt and her calm as a sign of defiance. You tried to use your authority to crush her, to prove that you were the one in control. But you had no idea. You had no idea you were trying to break a woman who had faced down things you can't even imagine. You weren't a predator hunting prey. You were a bully who just made the biggest mistake of your life. The courtroom, which had been silent before, now erupted. A storm of whispers erupted from the gallery. The judge banged her gavel, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a single cup of water. The entire case had just been atomized. The story wasn't about a drug bust anymore. It was about a small-town cop with an ego the size of a mountain and the decorated war hero he had tried to destroy. The truth, which had been a whisper, was now a roar that was shaking the very foundations of the room. The hunt was over. But in the stunned, silent heart of the storm, it was the hunter who was now the prey. the silence that fell over the courtroom after the final devastating revelation was a thick, suffocating blanket. It was a silence filled with shock, with the clatter of preconceived notions falling to the floor. The first sound to break it was a hoarse-choked whisper from the prosecutor's table. D.A. Thompson, the man who had built a career on his sharp mind and sharper convictions, looked like a man who had just stared into the sun. His face, which had been a mask of confidence just moments ago, was now a landscape of pure horror. He stared at Officer Miller, then at the quiet woman he had tried to bury under the weight of the law. And the dawning realization of what he had done seemed to suck the air right out of his lungs. Slowly, as if moving through thick water, he pushed his chair back and stood up. All eyes turned to him. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at Alara, and in his eyes she saw a man drowning in his own regret. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking, barely audible. The prosecution. We moved to dismiss all charges against Ms. Vance. Immediately, with prejudice. The words hung in the air, a formal surrender. There was no objection from the defense table. The judge, her face a mask of cold fury, didn't even look at her notes. Her eyes were locked on the pale, trembling figure of Officer Miller, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Motion granted," she said, her voice like a shard of ice. "All charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Ms. Vance is free to go. Bailiff, please remove the restraints." The sound of the key turning in the handcuffs was the most beautiful music Alara had ever heard. As the cold, unforgiving metal fell away from her wrists, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over her. She placed a hand on the defense table to steady herself, taking a deep, shuddering breath for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The courtroom was no longer a cage designed to hold her. It was just a room, and the people staring at her were no longer a jury of her peers, but a group of people who had just witnessed a miracle. Their eyes held a mixture of awe, of shame, and of deep, profound apology. But the most dramatic change had occurred in the man who had started it all. Officer Finn Miller was no longer a hero. He was a caricature of a broken man, his uniform suddenly looking like a costume he had no right to wear. The authority that had clung to him like a second skin had been stripped away, revealing a petty, terrified creature underneath. The smug smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of disbelief and pure animal panic. The judge wasn't finished with him. She fixed him with a look of such intense disgust that it seemed to have a physical weight. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the room, "you will remain in your seat. You are now in direct contempt of this court, and I hold you personally responsible for this absolute travesty of justice. You are not to move. You are not to speak. This is not over. Not by a long shot. It was a promise, not a threat. And it was a promise that was kept with a terrifying and swift efficiency. Before the sun had set on that day, the entire landscape of the case had shifted. The district attorney's office, now in a frantic scramble to save its own reputation, from the wreckage announced not just an internal review, but a full-scale criminal investigation into Officer Miller. But it was the arrival of two unassuming men in dark suits that truly signaled the end. They didn't announce themselves as heroes. They moved with the quiet, unshakable presence of federal authority. And when they walked into the police station, it wasn't to assist. It was to take over. The charges against Miller were no longer a local matter of police misconduct. This was now a federal case. Violation of civil rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and most damningly, attempting to frame a highly decorated military veteran. The case had been elevated from a small-town drama to a federal offense, and it would be pursued with the relentless full weight of the United States government. Suddenly, evidence that had been so elusive for Alara appeared from every corner of the department. The police force, eager to cut ties with Miller and distance themselves from the scandal, threw him to the wolves with an almost desperate enthusiasm. Forensic technicians, re-examining the drug evidence with a new, urgent mandate, found Miller's fingerprints all over the plastic baggie, and not a single trace of Alara's. The dashcam footage from Miller's car, which had been officially deemed corrupted and unrecoverable during the initial investigation, was miraculously recovered by a senior tech specialist who now had the full backing of the feds. The footage was damning. It showed Miller stopping her for no discernible reason, and later, it clearly captured him turning his back to the camera and finding the drugs in an area of the car he had already thoroughly searched. The white pest control van was traced back to a second cousin of Miller's, a man with a long list of minor grievances and a desperate need for cash. When faced with federal agents and the very real possibility of a long prison sentence, he didn't hesitate. He folded completely, confessing in detail to his role in the frame-up for a few $100s and the promise of a favor from his powerful cousin. But the final crushing blow came from Miller's own colleagues. The infamous blue wall of silence, which had protected him for so long, crumbled into dust the moment his invincibility was shattered. Officers who had quietly resented him, who had been intimidated by him, or who had simply known he was a bad cop, suddenly found their voices. One officer, a veteran who had always followed the rules, provided a sworn statement detailing how Miller had bragged to him in the locker room. It's about teaching a lesson to a stuck-up woman who thought she was better than everyone else. Another officer with a young family and a mortgage produced server logs that showed Miller had used his privileged access to the police database to look up Ilara's personal information, her address, and her financial records dozens of times without any legitimate police reason. They didn't paint a picture of a rogue cop. They painted a portrait of a man who had systematically and deliberately weaponized his badge for his own personal vendetta, for Ilara. The days and weeks after the trial were a strange, disorienting mix of vindication and exhaustion. She didn't hire a publicist. She didn't stand on the courthouse steps and give a triumphant speech. She just went home. The world she had lost now clamored at her door, desperate for her forgiveness. Her landlord, utterly humiliated and terrified of a lawsuit, personally came to her door with a bouquet of flowers to tear up the eviction notice and beg for her to stay. The city planning committee, which had so gleefully cast her aside, now called her in a panic, not just offering her her old job back, but creating a new position for her as special consultant on urban green spaces with a salary that was almost embarrassing. Her phone, once a source of dread, now rang off the hook with calls from old friends, distant relatives, and even total strangers, all of them offering their support, their apologies, their outrage on her behalf.
Ow.
The community that had so easily turned its back on her was now desperate to welcome her back into its fold. But something had fundamentally changed. The quiet, ordered world she had built for herself had been violated, its walls breached by a darkness she could never have anticipated. She knew it could never be exactly the same again. One quiet afternoon. A few weeks later, there was a hesitant knock on her door. She opened it to find the prosecutor, D.A. Thompson, standing on her porch, looking like a man who hadn't slept or eaten a proper meal in days. He held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim with a nervous energy that was completely at odds with his usual polished demeanor. "Miss Vance," he began, and the shame in his voice was a raw, open wound. I don't have the words to tell you how sorry I am. I was arrogant. I saw a case I could win, a conviction that would look good on my record, and I let my ambition blind me to the truth. I put an innocent person in a cage, and I nearly destroyed a hero. There is no excuse for what I did. None. Ilara looked at him, at the genuine gut-wrenching remorse in his eyes. In her old life, she would have identified him as a threat, analyzed his weaknesses, and neutralized him. But now she just saw a man, flawed, broken man, who had made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. Holding on to her anger against him would be like carrying a poison in her own heart, and she was too tired for that. "I accept your apology," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "What matters now is that you learn from it, that you do better." He nodded, a flicker of something like relief in his eyes. "I will," he promised. "I swear to you." As he walked away, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat, Ilara felt the last bit of the hard, cold knot of bitterness in her stomach finally dissolve. She had no more room for it. The final chapter for Miller played out months later in a federal courtroom, a far cry from the local stage where he had once reigned. Finn Miller, stripped of his badge, his pension, and his very name. Stood before a federal judge and pled guilty to every single charge. The judge, looking down at him with undisguised contempt, sentenced him to 10 years in a federal penitentiary, the exact same sentence Elara had been facing. As he was led away in handcuffs, his face ashen and his eyes empty, the story finally, truly ended. Elara saw the report on a flickering television in the corner of a small diner. She didn't feel a surge of victory. She didn't feel a sense of payback. She just felt a quiet, profound sense of finality. It was over. She left a few dollars on the counter for her coffee, walked out into the cool evening air, and didn't look back. She didn't go back to her quiet little house on the corner. She got into her car and just started driving. She drove for hours with no destination in mind, letting the ribbon of unspooling road carry her through the heart of the country she had served. She drove through sleepy towns and sprawling cities, a ghost moving through the world she had fought, so hard to protect. She finally stopped as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. It was a quiet, deserted beach on the rugged coast. She got out of the car, kicked off her shoes, and walked to the edge of the water, where the sand was cool and damp. The sky was a breathtaking canvas of deep purple and soft, hopeful pink. The air smelled of salt and endless possibility. She stood there, the gentle, rhythmic waves washing over her bare feet, and felt a peace she hadn't known she was capable of feeling anymore. The world had tried its best to break her. It had tried to define her, to trap her, to turn her into a victim or a villain. But she had endured. Not by calling on the formidable, secret skills of her past, but by holding on to the simple, unshakable strength of her own integrity. She had faced down the darkness not with a weapon, but with the stubborn, unwavering light of the truth. The sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a brilliant golden path in water.